Well, I think the conference takes place at a very important time in terms of what is happening in South Africa and the world. It is taking place at a time when there are a lot of disruptive forces globally and domestically at an economic and political level. For instance, if you are in the UK, you had Brexit. If you are in the US, you had the Trump presidency. And in South Africa in 2016, we saw the beginnings of what I think will be the political disruption of the dominance of the ANC. But there's something else happening. The black swans are flocking, which means there's a lot of uncertainty in the world. There's a lot of uncertainty in South Africa. In fact, uncertainty has become a constant. So the challenge we face is that of being able to anticipate and read the disruptive forces and think beyond them. And at the same time, be able to cope with black swans when they do land in our environment, whether it is political or environment. And as you know, in South Africa's economic problem is political, which means we must get our politics right. We must manage political uncertainty very well in order to do well in and with the economy. Well, to understand the nature of political disruption in the ANC, you have to go back to the beginning of our democracy in 1994, at which point, and for the better part of the past 23 years thereafter, the ANC is very dominant. And South Africa lacks what we call substantive uncertainty. Now, when a country lacks substantive uncertainty, we mean that the outcome of elections is always predictable. But that is changing, as we saw with the results of the 2016 local government election, that we no longer lack substantive uncertainty in the same way that we did for the better part of the past 23 years. Because the ordinary citizen is beginning to activate his or her sense of agency to the detriment of the ruling party. And they are doing so because there is a gap that is widening in South Africa, a gap between the administrative dimensions of our democracy and the substantive dimensions of our democracy. In other words, by administrative dimensions, we're talking about the fact that we have democratic rights, freedom of speech, the right to vote, and so on. And we have done very well in that respect, and we have one of the most respected constitutions in the world. So we've done very well with regard to the administrative dimensions of our democracy. We have not done as well when it comes to the substantive dimension of our democracy, that is, the ability of democracy to deliver a better life for citizens beyond the democratic and constitutional rights, which means the challenge South Africa faces, or one of the challenges South Africa faces, is that of bridging the gap between the administrative and the substantive. And the reason citizens voted in the manner they did, and the ANC suffered losses in Tshwane, Nelson Mandela Bay, and Joburg, is because the voter perceives this gap between the administrative and the substantive in a way that makes him or her believe that this gap is damaging not only to their political lives, but more importantly, to their economic lives. And they're beginning to punish the dominant party for that. But they're also responding to other forces of disruption, which are causing instability inside the ANC. So we have a situation where the power and influence of President Jacob Zuma and the dominant faction in the ANC is being challenged. But the battle is taking place in a way that is imposing an image crisis on the president, And the president is causing collateral damage to the image of the party. And the image crisis of the party is causing damage to the party through voters who are beginning to walk away to vote for other parties. The question is whether in December, when the ANC goes to its national conference, will they elect an individual who disrupts the power and influence of a dominant faction in the ANC that is destroying the ANC, and some might even argue that is destroying the country, because there are two things that are lacking now. It is trust and confidence. And if we do not deal with these two problems, what follows is lack of legitimacy, particularly the lack of legitimacy of the state. So trust has broken down between those who govern and those who are governed. And trust has broken down between those who govern and the private sector. And you need the private sector and those who govern in order to change the direction of the economy. Without them uniting behind a common vision for our economy, a vision that delivers growth, you will not find a cure for the mistrust or distrust. But then at a political level, the lack of trust between those who are governed and those who govern may cause the citizen to lose confidence in the political class as a whole, which means actually if we are not careful, damage will be done not only to the ANC, but the damage may extend to the political class as a whole, to the extent that voters may come to two conclusions, or citizens may come to two conclusions: that they cannot trust politicians and political parties, and more importantly, they may begin to question the efficacy of the democratic project to deliver a better life for them. And once you reach that point where they even begin to lose confidence in the state, that may facilitate all sorts of impunity, not only on the part of the political class, but also on the part of those who are governed, that is the citizens. We must first ask ourselves, what do we mean by a state of equilibrium? And ask ourselves whether equilibrium is possible. Or, even better, whether equilibrium is desirable. And the reason I ask these questions is that those of us who grew up during apartheid fought against the apartheid government, because what we wanted is a society that would be the antithesis of apartheid society. Equilibrium for us is a society that is the antithesis of apartheid. Equilibrium for me is something beyond that. A society that is qualitatively better than even the antithesis of apartheid. In other words, equilibrium must force us to see as a benchmark a society that is qualitatively better than the society which replaced apartheid society. And then when you put it that way, you realize that equilibrium is not enough. But more importantly, in economic terms, not only is it not enough, it may not be desirable. Because when you reach a state of equilibrium, the question is, what kind of forces are you suppressing? You are suppressing forces that are bad for society, but you may also be suppressing forces that are good for society. So the desirable order for me is an order in which you have a battle between forces that are good for society and forces that are bad for society. And we as societies make choices between these two that in the end are good for society. Realizing that after you have made that choice, you begin the process of making other choices in future. So you actually never reach a state of equilibrium. Well, let me start with a cliche.
Okay.
It is said that we must think globally and act locally or domestically. It is also said, to use another cliche, that all politics is domestic. And I agree with that. But my reasons for agreeing with that are different. I think both at a global and domestic level, we must act and think globally and vice versa. Which means that it is not enough to think globally. We must act globally too. We are not too small to act globally. But even in our domestic terrain, we are not too small to act globally. What do I mean by that? If you look at the global economy and you look at cross-border trade, one of the things we have to realize is that cross-border trade is about intra-company movement or movements of finished and semi-finished goods. And that is why the iPhone is manufactured in 9 different parts of the world by the same company. Which means one of our challenges is to become part of that intra-company movement of finished and semi-finished goods. We must become part of that chain. And you can't become part of that chain if you are content with thinking only in domestic terms or thinking only in global terms. You must act in global terms. In other words, what you do domestically must also be about occupying a particular position in the global economy, in addition to delivering a better life domestically to citizens. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is about dreaming, but dreaming actively. And what that means for me is that we must collectively try to dream the kind of world we want into being. So we must think about what kind of world do we want and dream it into existence. Because if we don't, others, inside and outside South Africa, will dream the kind of world they want into existence. But I'm not talking about meditation here. I'm not talking about putting a mat on the floor, sitting on it, and humming some mantra and thinking of dreaming a particular world into existence. No, I'm talking about active dreaming. That dreaming must be followed by action. So that's the second thing we need to do. The third thing we need to do, if we are to cope with the forces of disruption at an economic and at an economic and political level, at a domestic and global level, and cope also with black swans, we must free ourselves from the known. Because one of the problems and one of the reasons why Brexit was not predicted, even by highly educated people, why the Trump victory in the US elections was not predicted, even by people who should have known better, is because we're slaves of the known. Now, if we're slaves of the known, we can't innovate. And when I talk to audiences about disruption, I ask a question. I say to them, given the fact that we know scientifically that our universe will cease to exist in 5 billion years, what kind of people do we want to be? What kind of companies do we want to be? What kind of businesses do we want? Do we want people, businesses, and companies which say, well, the world will come, the universe will come to an end in 5 billion years, so we need not bother? Or do you want to be the kind of person, company, and business which says, when it does end, this universe, I want to watch it ending from another universe? And if you think that way, you will start thinking about the kind of research and development that will be required and sources of energy that will be required to go through this tunnel that will take you to another universe, and from that universe be a spectator watching your old universe coming to an end. So basically that's what we're being asked. What kind of companies, businesses, and persons do you want to be? Those will say, well, there's no need to bother. Or those will say, well, we must watch the end of this universe from another universe. You know, as some of the speakers were speaking, talking about the challenges facing the insurance industry, the dominant thought in my head was about transport for some reason. It was about vehicle insurance. Because I kept on thinking, yes, people need vehicle insurance. And that's the problem. That one of the things the insurance industry may want to do, and different insurance companies may want to do, is to increase their market share in vehicle insurance. And I kept on thinking, this kind of thinking is quite limited. And as I was listening, there was a slight improvement. I heard a speaker talking about driverless cars. And I say slight improvement, because by the time you design insurance instruments that will deal with driverless cars, you're already late for the next force of disruption. We are late because you need to change the way you think. People don't need vehicles, they need transport. I don't know that you see the difference. If the paradigm from which you operate is a paradigm which says people need transport, not vehicles, the paradigm in which you provide insurance also changes. It's no longer a paradigm for vehicle insurance, but it's a paradigm for transport insurance. For instance, there may come a time when it takes you seconds to travel from Joburg to Durban. What kind of insurance will that require? In other words, when you think of disruption, you think of an innovation, what you must remember is that by the time you think of it, we're already there, and therefore you are late. So what we need to do is to avoid being late. And there's a connection between that and politics, in the sense that if in the business economic environment we are late, there'll be a lot of instability in the political environment, because you will fail to deliver the kinds of economic growth that your citizens need to be employed and to improve their lives. And who do they turn on when that happens? On the political class and the economic class. So there's a connection between the two. So you do need a synergy between what politicians think and what we think in the economic environment, between what we do in the economic environment and what we do in the political environment. Otherwise, contrary to what we think, and I heard at this conference, I hear in many conferences, people think disruption is always a positive force. No, disruption can be quite negative. In other words, if you think of any technological advancement, remember that any technological advancement can be used for two things: development and in pursuit of evil. So disruption is not always a positive force. And if you think of it that way, then you need this collective thought and action so that you harness disruption and you avoid negative forces of disruption.